Hi everyone, this is Blue. I've prepared this line art for anyone to color, and I will be reblogging, retweeting, and sharing any colored piece you tag me in. So check out the Tumblr post I have linked in the description and show me what you got. Today I'm going to walk through how to quickly get your flat colors down on a line art like this. I'll be showing the process in both Clip Studio Paint as well as in Paint Tool SAI, but the basic principles apply to basically any program you can use for digital art. The main tools we're going to be using are the Magic Wand tool, the paint bucket, a solid hard brush, clipping masks, and then I'll be showing one way to achieve a cell shaded rendering effect using the lasso tool and layer methods. And I have a special, awesome, absolutely life-saving tool that I call the ice cream tool that will be linked below, and you can skip to the time codes that are relevant in the description. With that, let's begin. Starting off in Clip Studio Pro, I've prepared a few versions of this line art for you depending on your own workflow. I have the fully detailed line art, a simplified version of the line art, and a bunch of other folders you can choose to use or not. I've also included my sketch folders so you can see how I work if you're interested in that. The reason I included a simplified line art is because there are sections that I'm circling here which I know the Magic Wand tool will struggle with. There are corners that are too tight or gaps that are too small, and if we paint bucket in those areas, we will end up with patches that don't have color and it looks really bad. The scars and the facial tattoos of this character are all in a separate folder for a similar reason, and can be toggled visible or invisible. For the purpose of this tutorial, I have them toggled off. I prepared some colors ahead of time and I'm going to make a palette. Your workflow can be drastically different, of course, but when I'm using these methods of coloring, I like to keep every segment of the character as a different color and a different layer, and so having a palette ready to go ahead of time can really speed things up. Usually I don't color using a white background, I color on a darkish colored background. This changes how our eye views the relative color, and I find it easier to work faster. I toggle the gray on and off at certain points so that I can see if there are any gaps in my colors, but this is primarily how I work. Alright, I've made a new folder for the flat colors, and we'll be using a new layer for every individual color we're putting down. The main tool we're going to be using is the Magic Wand tool. There are a couple of things to keep in mind with this tool. In Clip Studio, I usually tell it to refer to all layers. This way I can stay on a new empty layer, but the Magic Wand tool will still respect the line art that's above it. In most programs, there is some sort of setting similar to area scaling. This changes how much the Magic Wand will overshoot or undershoot the selection area based on the line art above it. In Clip Studio, I can go negative and end up with a much smaller area selected inside the line art, or I can go positive and overshoot it. If I stick right at 0, it will seemingly respect my line art, but usually I find this leads to jagged edges and missing pieces. There are a couple of problems you might run into right off the bat. I'm showing one here that happens most often in Clip Studio, and I can't figure it out. The Magic Wand tool is pretty smart, but it's not that smart, and sometimes it will decide not to select certain parts of this drawing for no discernible reason. Anytime you have an artifact like this, you can paint over it with the marker tool, or you can go in and use the Magic Wand tool and your shift key, and by shift and clicking, you can add selection areas like I'm doing here. This can be pretty tedious, like there are a couple of pixels here that just won't get selected, so usually I just paint them in later. Once you have an area that's selected to your satisfaction, then we can go in and use the paint bucket tool. In Clip Studio specifically, we have options similar to the Magic Wand tool, but I usually tell it just to refer to the editing layer because we've already done the work of selecting something. This has left some small blank spaces when I applied the color, but I usually wait until the very end to fix them. I am going to show you a nearly perfect way to avoid these problems at the end of the video, but there are basics here that apply to any digital art program. This layer is going to be all of the skin color. I've gone in and selected with the Magic Wand tool every piece of skin in this line art. The Paint Bucket tool requires me to click on every single one of these areas again to fill them, but if I simply take a very large, hard, opaque brush, I can cover the whole area all at once. Next, I'm going to go for the gold on her shoulders. I select those areas, make a new layer for that specific color, and fill it in with a large brush. If you toggle the full line art, you can see that we've filled in the base area, and the detailed lines sit perfectly on top of it, ready for shading when we're done. Or you can leave it just like this, because I think it looks cool. So going back to the simplified line art, we're going to just repeat the process of making a new layer for another section of color, selecting with the Magic Wand, and then filling in with the large brush or the paint bucket. I do sometimes make exceptions to my one color per layer rule that I've been showing you. You can use multiple colors cleanly on the same layer, like I'm doing with the earring. In this case, I select the metal part of the earring and paint it gold, and then on the same layer, I select the tassel part of the earring and paint it red. The downside of this is that I have to be careful if I want to change either of these colors later. But there are certain art processes that I have seen and used where having all your colors on one layer is actually really helpful. In really, really small areas like on the ring or the edges of these claws, the magic wand tool can be a pain, in which case I just go in with a small brush to fix it really quickly so I don't forget them. And then of course I'm showing you that I forgot a part. Now I'm going to show you how easy it is to change colors using the separate layer technique. I've just put down this red on her waist sash, as I'm calling it, and I've decided that it's actually too dark. Back in the old days, if you used the paint bucket tool multiple times on the same spot, it would keep overfilling your original area of color, and you'd end up with a shapeless blob that was much larger than what you started with. What I'm going to do here is lock off all parts of this layer that are not colored. This is called transparency locking because I am telling the program that the only things I want to be able to change are the things that are already colored on this layer. It's almost universally designated as a checkerboard with a padlock on it, no matter what program you're in. Once I've done that, I can choose a different color, and then either using the paint bucket tool or a brush, I can change the color without overfilling. If I try to draw outside of the area, my color will not show up. This is a great way to keep things neat and tidy. Later in this video, I'm going to show you how to add one more level of color with cell shading. You can skip to that time code if you like. For now, I have all my colors in place, each on a different layer. If you want to keep it flat colored like this, you can just toggle on the detailed line art, scars, and the face tattoos and call it a day. But real quick, I'm going to show this exact same process for coloring in Paint Tool Side because it is a little different. It's a fantastic art program that many people use, but there are some quirks. I recommend checking out ABD Illustrates to see how a pro colors inside, but here's my basic rundown. It's a much simpler program than most. The main thing to realize is that some of the terms are different. In Clip Studio, the magic wand is smart enough to automatically detect line art in other layers, even when you're not on that layer. In Paint Tool Side, we need to tell the magic wand specifically what layer it should look at by specifying a layer. So we select our line art layer and toggle the selection source button. Then we can go back to an empty layer for flat color, and the magic wand will select based on that layer. It still misses some things, but I do find that the magic wand tool inside is a little more straightforward and thorough than in Clip Studio. Generally, it doesn't leave as many gaps as it does in Clip Studio, and in Paint Tool Side, you can change how much it overestimates its selection area with range of transparency, just like you did with area scaling in Clip Studio. If you accidentally click on your line art, like I just showed, you will select all of your line instead of the space between them. So just be careful. This happens in Clip Studio, but less often. Besides that, everything is exactly the same. You can use the paint bucket or the marker to fill things in, control the transparency locking, and then you have your flat colors down. Let's pretend that I finished all my coloring. We're ready for some advanced shading. This process is basically the same in Paint Tool Side, Clip Studio, Photoshop, or whatever program you're using. We're going to be using something called clipping groups or layer masks. In your program, make a new layer above your base color. In this case, I'm making a new empty layer above the hair layer. Then toggle the clipping group option. This essentially acts as a transparency lock, but instead of locking the transparency of the layer you're working on, it respects the transparency in the layer you're clipped to. I can draw just about anywhere now, but it will not show up beyond the places that are already colored by the hair base, like this. I can draw something and then clip it, and it will disappear outside of the base color. This is super useful for making clean highlights and shading. To make it even faster, I'm going to use layer effects. Not a lot of beginner artists know about layer effects, but they can really push your art forward in interesting ways by revealing interesting color combinations, or at the very least, it speeds up small things like getting in a base shade or highlight. Take the exact same color as the hair base, just using the eyedropper tool without any adjustment. I've drawn it across the hair on the clipping group layer, and it looks invisible because it's just the same exact color. However, if I set the layer mode to screen, the color lightens based off of what's underneath it. If I do multiply instead, it darkens the color, and there are many other layer modes to choose from. So let's choose a light source and get in our base shape. I'm going to use the lasso selection tool here and draw a general blob, not necessarily trying to stay within the lines because the clip layer will be keeping us in the lines anyway. Then I'm going to use the bucket tool on my clipped screen layer, and there I have a highlight. I can shape up the highlight using the marker tool. I can select additional areas and add more color, and I can refine it later if it needs to be refined. I can also achieve the exact same things without layer modes just by using another color instead of relying on screen or multiply to choose the light and dark colors for me. The advantage of multiply layers for shadows is that it will darken an area while keeping saturation high. A lot of beginner artists will use desaturated grays or blacks to shade with, but if you look at color theory lessons, you'll find that shadows actually tend to be very saturated, and multiply layers can help remind you to maintain that saturation, sometimes to your detriment. As you can see here, by applying this color as a multiply layer, it turns it into a pretty extreme brown, but you can mitigate that by changing the opacity of this layer, which is what I usually do when I'm just getting the shapes of the shadows down. I'm going to use a screen layer to add some rim light, and the clipping group will keep me from going outside the line. As you can see, I switched to using the marker tool again. Before I upgraded my tablet, I mostly stuck to using the selection tool for these shapes, but now my personal workflow is using markers for this process. So we have a dark shadow and a bright highlight. And while the skin tone is definitely somewhere between the two, it's a sharp step from light to medium to dark. There are a couple of ways we can soften that transition. The first method is to select a color that's slightly darker than the highlight and draw in some shapes surrounding the highlight we've already drawn. I try to make these shapes contoured to the face to indicate its shape. There's still a big difference between this mid-tone and the skin color, however, so I would theoretically keep doing this until I was satisfied by how many transition levels I have and how smooth it looks. That gives an almost pop art effect, and it's really useful in duping things like the Hades game art style. There's no actual blending involved, just these transition color blobs. You can also put down your colors with a soft brush like the airbrush, which automatically does a little bit of blending around the edges. What I started doing as I adopted a more painterly style was using the watercolor brush tool, which blends things really nicely. Going back to Clip Studio, theoretically the process is exactly the same. I'll be making a clipping layer, setting it to multiply, and then using the selection tool and the paint bucket to fill in shadow shapes. But I realized that I actually messed up a little. You can see that there are some jarring white spaces where there's no color being put down. This is because my base skin layer doesn't actually extend to these areas, and my clipping layer is seeing those and telling me, no, you can't put color here. To fix it, all I have to do is go back to my skin layer and put down a little brush of color, and there you go, fixed. Like I said, these days I like using a brush to block in some nice curvy shapes for the shadows on her face, and I'm just going to change the opacity to make it a little less harsh. And then it's time for me to show you the real magic. I've shown you how using the magic wand and the lasso selection tools and the paint bucket, you can end up missing corners and running into problem areas, especially in detailed line art. There is a mind-blowing tool that someone developed for Clip Studio that works better than all of the aforementioned tools. I call it the ice cream tool because its icon is an ice cream cone. In the tool settings, I have told it to refer to my reference layer, which is indicated by this weird stylus with a line through it shape. I've designated my simplified line art as this reference layer. Now on a new layer for this color, I'm going to use the ice cream tool to roughly select the area I want to fill in with the skin tone. I'm on a layer below my line art layer, and layer order is really important with this tool for some reason, but it miraculously knows exactly where I want to fill with color. It respects all of my lines and edges, and you can tweak the settings to overfill or underfill just like with the area scaling on the magic wand tool. But this tool is far superior to anything else I've used, and it makes the whole process much faster. I can go in on a new layer and select where the eyebrows should be, and it knows not to fill in the gap between them. I love this tool very much, but it does mess up sometimes. If you don't select the appropriate area, and I don't know how it exactly determines what that means, instead of filling in the area within the lines, it'll only paint inside the lines themselves. This can lead to a bit of fuzziness that I don't like. I usually just undo it and then try again until it works. I still find this faster than my other method. I can continue to add these colors on the same layer, but it is no longer as smart as it once was. And so that's why I say to make a new layer for every color with this tool in particular. So let's pretend that I have all my colors in and it's time to shade. I don't do this part with the ice cream tool, but I use the same process I mentioned earlier instead. And that's about all I have to teach you. I hope it was useful. I'm not a professional artist or even a really experienced one, but these are the things I've picked up from watching artists. I recommend checking out the Drawfee crew as well as their draw class episodes on their side channel. ABD Illustrates, Proko, Marco Bucci, and Ross Draws are also great channels to check out. They're a few of my favorite people to watch just to pick up their process, and they're always having fun with their art. If you have any questions, hit me up on Twitter or Tumblr, and remember to tag me if you end up coloring this line art, and I'll be sure to share it.